Lessons learned, or have they been? This time on Poll Hub, it's nearly 2020, so why are we still talking about 2016? Some perceive the 2016 pre-election polls to be a cautionary tale for this election cycle. But are the dynamics the same? Then, robocalls are on the hot seat. What does this mean for survey researchers? We explain. This is Poll Hub. Let's get to it. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Mary Griffith, Media Director for the Marist College Poll, and sitting in for the irreplaceable Jay DeDapper.
Aw, and I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Meringoff, Director of the Marist Institute for Public Opinion.
Yeah, we sent Jay off to polling boot camp this week. So we hope that he
focus group boot
well,
camp.
but we hope that he comes back.
Or he doesn't get snowed in. Yeah.
No one more so than me. So about a week and a half ago, the New York Times published an article by Giovanni Russinello, and the title was 4 Problems with 2016 Trump Polling That Could Play Out Again in 2020. Now, while I was reading this article, I kind of felt like Bernie Sanders in 2016 during the debate with Hillary Clinton when he said, enough with the emails. Well, enough with the 2016 postmortem. I mean, am I warranted in my frustration about the constant discussion of the 2016 pre-election polls?
Absolutely. I think we've all kind of gone down this road and went back down the road again. And, I think, look, 2016 was misperceived, and we've talked about this on the podcast in terms of, the polls were not really wrong. And yet the articles seem to keep reclaiming or, restating that, in fact, that was the case. And we've talked about how the prognosticators had talked about a chance of Hillary winning as high as, I think, 96% or so. And those weren't polls. They didn't do their polls. The whole thing was just a misguided thing. Then APOR, and I was on this committee, did its election post-mortem, and that's really what this article was still about. And I think they seem to have, the author has 4 issues, and I think we probably have 4 issues with the article, too.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of this stems from the fact that I think the conventional wisdom, obviously in 2016, was that Hillary Clinton was going to win, that she was going to win handily, perhaps with a very large electoral college landslide. And how that actually developed was not so much, as we have talked about, from the polls that were done at the time, but really from the aggregators and prognosticators who were using a couple of things. Yes, they were using some polls. They were also using social media and data analytics based on that. And then many of them had their own special sauce. I know Nate Silver, who has been predicting and prognosticating about elections for a couple of cycles now, and was, quite successful in 2012 and 2008. I'm not sure he was actually doing that in 2008, but probably the midterm shortly thereafter. But again, if the polling is very good, there's not really a lot of need for all of these other models. And Lee, you were actually on the committee, and I know you were somewhat frustrated by the committee, by some of the discussions that you guys were having.
Well, they defined their task narrowly, and I voiced this at the time, in terms of talking about polls and polls only, when we didn't really think that was the culprit. Now, admittedly, in the report by the American Association of Public Opinion Research, which is our kind of like guiding light in all these matters.
Well, it's our professional association.
And in the report, they do correctly point out that the national polls, including the Marist poll, were right on target. Then they found out that, some state polls weren't. And we took the position at the time and since and before and during and after that, in fact, some of the state polls had not been in the field after the Comey letter, for example. They didn't get the late action. We know from the exit polls and even in this article in the New York Times that there was late movement, and most of that went to Donald Trump. So if you have late movement and it's going to Donald Trump, that may explain a whole lot about
So
what the polls
let's
are.
just go through. Let's go through some of the findings, because I know we've talked about this at different points in time, but the New York Times article, I think, really had an impact again on kind of reinforcing this misperception. So the first thing is
That was the word I was looking for earlier. Reinforcing. That's a good word. Yeah.
What about this issue of weighting by education?
Well, we've been doing some work on that, and I think we're going to be talking in the not too distant future about having done some studies to look at the
With our
education
partners, NBC
with our partner
News.
at NBC, and how that, which is a kind of like a convenient resting point for this argument, may not be the right way to go in and of itself. We're going to be, that's something we're going to take on. My big issue in this is the shy Trump voters.
Yeah, that's the second thing.
Yeah, and one of the things about Trump voters is I don't think they're particularly shy, and also, they wouldn't necessarily know that they're wrong in their perceptions of socially acceptable answer, because they are being reinforced in terms of the so-called echo chamber, in terms of what they're watching and their friends and their families. It's all very much similar.
Let's just explain that just a little bit, because I think when talking about the shy Trump voter, I think some of the folks also on the APOR committee
It's in there.
talked about that this might actually be a form of social desirability bias. So what exactly does that mean in this context?
Well, social desirability basically means that people might not express their true feelings when responding during a telephone survey. So they may feel uncomfortable expressing support for a candidate such as Donald Trump.
Yeah, and so what that means from our vantage point, it's a great pollster cop-out, because what we're saying is the polls we did were okay, but we can't help it if the people weren't telling the truth in our surveys.
And I think the point you're making is that they'd have to know that
they're not telling, that's a wrong answer.
Right.
And the other thing is, and it's simpler than that even for me, the national polls hit it on the head. The state polls are the ones who are being thought of as misleading. So the question then becomes, where are the shy Trump voters when it comes to the national polls? Why are they only in state polls? It makes absolutely no sense.
Well, also another point that they make here is that they focus on who's voting. And that really comes back to the idea of the likely voter model, which, as we've talked about before on this podcast, there is no one likely voter model that all polls follow or use, and that has to do with the art of polling. So this really isn't anything new, is it?
No.
likely voters, unfortunately, we talk about likely voters as if it is actually something. And it is. It's an attempt by pollsters to estimate and provide a probability or a likelihood that certain people are going to actually show up and vote and other people may not. And the problem is not the definition of what a likely voter is. The problem is, how do you measure who actually is a likely voter? And that is not something that all pollsters agree upon.
So this has to do with 2016, the postmortem from 2016, but what are the indicators that we should be looking at as we move into the 2020 general election cycle?
First of all, that Trump voters are not shy. Second of all, all kidding aside, we need to make sure, when are the polls in the field? We know from last time that you want to be as close to the actual election as possible. There are limitations, but if there's some late movement, you don't want to be missing that, or at least you don't want to maintain the illusion that these numbers are so precise that they're locked in, when in fact things can still change. I think that we got sort of ahead of our skis last time, and that may have been part of the problem.
So weighting by education, it can help in some instances. It's not the issue. The issue, which we have seen by some of the tests that we've been doing and looking back at our data is, and looking back at our sampling, is this is an issue of geography. It's not an issue of demography. The data that they had to use in the APOR committee when they were looking at education, they weren't looking at all the state polls. They didn't have the data from all of the different organizations. If you have a state that's very homogenous, weighting by education can help. If you have a state that is not homogenous. It's a diverse state. Education is not going to get you any closer to a Trump voter than any other poll. The shy Trump voter, let me just add that conclusion was based on a pre-election study by Morning Consult. Morning Consult is not an RDD scientific poll. It's a panel poll. They have a lot of different ways of modeling it to look like the election, but to base an entire conclusion about a particular group of voters, I think is very misleading using that particular data.
And I think also, if I could just jump in and say, one of the questions Mary asked about was, what is our lessons going ahead for 2020? And I think one of the things that we have to look at is when we look at these aggregators, which polls are they being including, and are they the scientific polls, or is it everything thrown in? Because last time, the aggregators really were aggravators going forward. And that's not my phrase. That was Mary's. I stole it from about a week ago. I'm going to be using it throughout the campaign.
So to actually take a step forward, and granted, there's a lot that we can still talk about 2016, but we actually have some things that may impact polling this time around. And one of it is something that actually started in 2015, where the FCC started changing the regulations about how people could be called, particularly with regard to cell phones. They made it such that for research groups and people who were appropriately calling people either for research or important business reasons, they made it much more difficult for them, and they made it much easier for robocalls. The nightmare that we all experience, regardless of which end of the phone we are on, robocalls are a disaster. So there's been some important legislation that's been coming down the pike, both at different state levels, but also at the federal level as well. Did one of you want to just talk about some of what's coming down?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things is there's a sense, because this disturbance to everybody's existence because of this telemarketing tsunami that we've been experiencing, and now there's attempts, and it looks like the Senate, Congress, and it looks like the President Trump is likely to sign legislation. We have here, folks, a bipartisan thing going on in Washington.
Shocking.
And there may be just a handful, and maybe even not that much, many of people who are objecting to going down this road.
So on Wednesday of this week, the House passed a bill that would significantly impact robocalls and limiting robocalls. And I believe that this bill that was passed pertained to what I believe is called a one-ring scam, and this has to do with using an illegal number, or a fake number rather, to call your phone one time, hang up, and then the respondent would then call the number back, and oftentimes the number would be to an overseas location, which then the person making the call would be hit with some serious charges for making that phone call. So that's what this particular piece of legislation has to do with. So there is an attempt to rein in robocalls, but there are some legitimate robocalls out there. And so, Barb, how does that kind of affect what it is that pollsters do?
And that's a really good question, and we're not really sure how all of these laws are going to play out. We know the fact that we've had this enormous proliferation of robocalls, and the way that they can get around the U.S. law is that most of these originate offshore.
Yeah.
And so although people who are doing legitimate either telemarketing or legitimate scientific research, they are they can be fined a good deal of money for every call that they can make. But basically, if you go offshore and you have this offshore phoning house, you're not under the U.S. law. So in order to try to deal with this, there have been a number of different suggestions, of which start of the point kind of origination, which is to enlist the different providers, the telephone providers and phone number providers, have them get involved. The technology certainly exists for them to be able to identify the origination of the call. It exists for them to be able to know whether whether this is a phone number that is being used to call people, randomly in rapid succession. But the telecom folks have been somewhat cautious about using the technology to block those kinds of calls because there hasn't been any kind of protection for them if they block the wrong call.
Yeah, of course.
And so they, in fact, can be sued for blocking a call that may have been intended to go through to someone. And when I say intended, it doesn't necessarily have to be, your child's school is calling and we accidentally blocked it. What happened there are some reasons why a lot of calls can originate from one number. So, for instance, emergency, police, some communities have the ability to text people within the community in a very large manner. Doctors' offices who are confirming appointments. There's a whole slew of actually appropriate reasons why a lot of calls may be coming from a single number. So the idea here is that I think what they're going to do is attempt to identify appropriate numbers where these calls can originate.
Yeah, and I would maintain, and people think the pollsters are the ones who are the villain in all this, but we're actually, in a sense, the victim as well, because it's making it harder to get people to respond. It's slowing down our process, and we want very much not to have the baby thrown out with the wash in these things. We want to make sure that if this problem gets cleared up in the telemarketing robocall area, that's going to make our jobs actually easier, and it'll also make people not have as many annoying calls as they've all been getting on their cell phones constantly.
And, well, as I said, it does remain to be seen how this is going to play out. Another technology is that, and I think we've already seen this, is a number of the telecom players have allowed people to use call blocking. To block numbers not in their contact list, or to allow just one ring from a number that is not in their contact list, or it goes immediately to a voicemail. There's a number of different versions of that technology. And I think we just need to be cautious because, as you mentioned, Lee, although this can be annoying and not everyone loves to get a phone call from a pollster asking their opinion, there's an awful lot of information that we garner, and it's not just the Maris poll, but it's the Centers for Disease Control, it's the National Institutes of Health, it's a lot of the numbers and things that we take for granted as the proportion of people who may be having problems from opioid dependency. That's not just about counting who comes into a hospital or who has overdosed. That's also from surveys about how people look at how people look at their health, think of their health, and the problems and issues that they are having as well. So there are a lot of scientific studies and a lot of information that we know about ourselves as a country and as a community that can be impacted by this.
And, just to use Jay's term and to get wonky for a second here, when we talk about robocalls, I think a lot of people think of the recorded voices and those irritating, calls that you might get during dinner time. But maybe we can just clear up for folks out there how pollsters use robocalls. And it isn't necessarily that automated voice that you hear on the other end. So what is the technology that they use, that we use?
Well, when we look at robocalls, and very often, you're absolutely right, Marion, we get the insurance, our car warranty.
My student loan, which I don't have anymore. They want it.
So we think of that. But part of it is about the technology we use to actually call phone numbers. And when doing scientific surveys, we're looking at randomly dialing numbers, of which many of them don't exist. So we would use technology to dial those numbers to find out, in fact, is this a busy number? Is this a number that has never been assigned to a household or a person? Is this a number that's associated with the business? And we could do that electronically. Now, with cell phones, we can no longer do that. We have to hand dial it individually. It has to originate from one person to another person. So that is certainly strained scientific research. And I think part of this proliferation of polling that we've seen and all these weird methods that we've seen and we're about to see as we go into 2020 with online calls or these kind of self-directed calls using recorded voices. These are all a result of the fact that it's become really expensive and very difficult to do it the right way.
Well, if people want us to be talking methods and get in the weeds, we sure have today.
Well, that will do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Yours truly, Mary Griffith, is our executive producer, and a special thanks to Harry Perrett for producing today's segment. Casey Schaff is off this week. Our Jay DeDapper will be editing this podcast remotely.
If he gets a break from polling boot camp.
Yeah, and we also take this time to thank the folks at the Roper Center Archives at Cornell for providing us with the ability to look back in time and survey questions and the results over the decades. And if you have any questions or comments, please reach out to us on social media. We're on Marist Poll on Twitter, Marist Poll on Facebook, and Instagram. Lots of places.
Yep, and if you want to continue to get wonky and this once-a-week thing is not enough for you, please go to our online learning platform. We've talked a little bit about it, the Marist Poll Academy. It's visual and engaging. And all you need is a phone, a laptop, an iPad, a computer, and it's free. Is that what you're going to remind me
That
of,
was
Mary?
exactly what I was going to remind you of, Barb.
And finally, if you want to hear more about Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review on your podcasting app of choice. Positive reviews always help us and help others find us. And while you're at it, if you haven't already, please subscribe.
I was at a fast food place today. They wanted to give me a positive review of the service. It was a little bit different.
Absolutely.
Have a great week.